So with that, we will go to Jill. Welcome, Jill.
We're in the middle of a submission process, which is very exciting for a bill called which we call the What is a Woman Bill, but actually is the legislation definitions of woman and man amendment bill. So I'm from the Women's Rights Party as well as WDI. We're a signatory and we are a registered political party, and we focus on issues that directly impact women and girls and children. So our main concern is protecting the rights of women and children. And we advocate for women's sex-based rights so that these rights are respected and extended and not eroded, as has been the case. Thus, we welcome the bill. And although we acknowledge that it won't achieve the goals it sets out to address in its current form, we're grateful for the opportunity to make submissions that would strengthen the bill in achieving its aims. So, as I said, we're a registered political party, and we were formed 130 years after women in New Zealand won through a huge campaign and a massive petition to Parliament of the day to win the vote for women. And they clearly knew in those days what a woman was. In fact, over the years, many of us have been, as Cara said, we were involved in the women's liberation movement and gay rights movements in the 60s and 70s and onwards. And so we were very clear in those days what a woman was. There was really no question. Far from we're accused of being a right-wing culture war that's been imported from the US, and that's what opponents of the bill say. We actually are an initiative of New Zealand women, and we're not linked with other political parties around the world, if there are some political parties representing women around the world. And so our candidates in the last election included all sorts of New Zealand women, the first trades qualified joiner, international and provincial sportswomen, health professionals, a chief executive, and business students. So we support the bill in principle. We definitely welcome legal certainty on the meaning of woman and man and the protection of sex-based rights that this is intended to secure. But as I said, in its current form, the bill won't achieve its goals. So we're proposing 6 amendments or recommendations, which we'll set out later in the submission. There's something very attractive in asking our lawmakers the simple question, what is a woman? And we all remember how Labour leader, who was then the Prime Minister, stuttered and stammered. And I'll just attempt to show you.
How do you and how does this government define a woman?
To be honest, Sean, that question's come slightly out of left field for me. Biology, sex, gender. People define themselves. People define their own genders.
So that's all it says. So there's a huge controversy happening in New Zealand about this bill, and all it does is it wants to insert in some legislation that would go across all New Zealand legislation unless a specific act stated otherwise. And it would extend by implication female and male wherever these are used. For example, the offence of male assaults female, which is in the Crimes Act. So it's intended to give legal certainty to sex-based provisions that are already in our law. And the leader of New Zealand First, which is the party that's put up the bill, says that it aims to address issues such as the safety of women in schools, changing rooms, sports and prisons. And of course, we agree with this aim, and we would include issues of privacy, dignity and fairness, as well as safety. we would also include girls as well as women. So lawyers who have reviewed the proposed bill have said it won't achieve its goals because the rules around sex discrimination under the Human Rights Act, for example, don't use the words that the bill sets out to define. And that's by and large true across all of our legislation. So if we look at the Human Rights Act, it only has one reference to men and women, and that is in an exception in relation to skills that you might be advertising for somebody. And it's not discrimination to say that you need either a man or a woman, one sex or another, for that role. In the Equal Pay Act, the word women appears only once. That's in defining the merit of a pay equity claim, where it talks about characterisation of the work as women's work and generally work that's generally associated with women in terms of the skills and qualities that are used in a particular occupational group. The Crimes Act there were a series of repeals in 2005 and 2007, so 20 years ago, and they took out basically all the references to women. So even our rape provisions are now sex neutral. It talks about person A inserting person A's penis into person B's genitalia. And the Parental Leave and Employment Protection Act, which you would think would mention women, and note it's now parental leave, not maternity leave, as it used to be, refers to women only once, and that is pregnant women. Well, I'm glad that they actually still got that there, but see, it's an act that goes back to 1987 in relation to notifying the employer. So that's the only time that women is used, the word woman. So that's why it's necessary to define sex, because the word sex does appear. So what we found in having a look and searching all the legislation that's particularly relevant to women is that as far back as 2002, the Sentencing Act was amended, and they added gender identity as an aggravating factor when someone is convicted of a crime that's motivated by hostility towards a group. Might be race, might be religion, a religious group. And they deliberately left out sex. We've got the Hansard, which is the record of what is said in Parliament at the time. They deliberately left out sex. So basically that's similar to hate crime legislation, but it's only in terms of sentencing. And then in 2004, we had a transsexual MP, Georgina Beyer, who put up a private member's bill to add gender identity to the Human Rights Act. Now, she was a Labor MP, so if Labor had supported that provision at the time, it would have gone forward as a government act, but it didn't. What the government did, this was regarded as too hot to handle with an election coming up, they reflected off to Crown Law for an opinion. And Crown Law said in 2006 that gender identity was covered by the prohibited ground of sex in the Human Rights Act, something that's never been tested in court, even though agencies such as the Human Rights Commission treat it as if it is settled law. We think that the Crown Law opinion probably protects people as the sex they are, but not necessarily as the gender they've assumed. And it's clear that at the time they wrote this opinion, then non-binary was not in there. Not a thing. So the first thing that we recommend is that we define sex, and we have a definition of sex in our both in our constitution and in our policy. So sex, in terms of what our definition says, it refers to biological sex, male or female. It is the first prohibited ground of discrimination in our Human Rights Act, which also says including pregnancy and childbirth. So it clearly was talking about women at the time the legislators wrote that piece of legislation. And as far as we're concerned, woman and girl mean human female, man and boy mean human male. And without a definition of sex, sexual orientation, which is defined in our Human Rights Act as attraction to the same, opposite, or both sex, cannot be coherently defined either. A lot is being said about intersex, and they're using this as an example of how this bill will completely disadvantage people who are intersex. And of course, we have defined in our submission that intersex is in fact differences of sex development. It's a rare congenital variation within male and female development. It's not a third sex. And we think that the bill should probably explicitly state that existing legal and medical provisions for people with DSDs are unaffected. So recognising DSDs does not undermine a binary biological definition of sex. We think it's really important that we make it explicit that the protected ground of sex in New Zealand law refers to biological sex, and that would close off reliance on this untested 2006 Crown Law opinion. We also, there's a conflict in the Legislation Act, which, as I said before, overrides all legislation. But it does say in one place, words denoting a gender include every other gender. So without amending it, it would directly conflict with the new sections that we would be adding. So it needs to say explicitly that the new provisions override section 16, actually preferably get rid of section 16 altogether. So, of course, the UK Supreme Court ruled that the definition of women includes girls. But we think it's problematic, and our Attorney General pointed it out when he gave his opinion to the MPs as they considered the bill at the first reading, that using the term adult in the bill's definition could exclude girls from protections they currently rely on, such as protections on as far as school toilets and changing rooms and girls' sports are concerned, but also the Contraception, Sterilisation and Abortion Act. And the problem in New Zealand is that there is no single age of majority. So we have different ages for consent, for driving, for voting, for drinking. And so we think the simplest way is just to add girl to the definition of woman and boy to the definition of man. And that would protect existing statutes while extending coverage to juveniles, minors. So the next thing is the definition of female and male, and that's where we have a more detailed definition because we don't want the circularity that you often get, and that is there in the current wording. So we've got a definition that talks about reproductive anatomy oriented towards producing ova, eggs, or large gametes that can be fertilised by small gametes, sperm. And we make the point that this applies across all life stages. So you could be a woman or a girl who's prepubescent, postmenopausal, has had a hysterectomy, chooses not to have children, but and so reproduction doesn't necessarily occur, well, not at that time anyway. That still doesn't mean that you're not a female and that you're not a woman. So, and we make the point that medical intervention could change your appearance, but not the underlying sex. So these changes are cosmetic. So let's have a look at what some of the main organisations are saying. The National Council of Women, which is supposed to be our peak body covering women, says that the bill's a waste of time. The money could be used for cash-strapped and time-poor community groups instead of preserving the status quo. And the fact is that if the current status quo was working for women, there wouldn't be a need for the bill to define what a woman is. But as we've seen recently from our sisters across the Tasman, the Australian Federal Court ruling confirmed the need for clear legal definitions of woman, man, male and female. and the removal of such definitions from the Australian Sex Discrimination Act in 2013 has created the preferential treatment of trans rights over the rights of women, just as our Crown Law opinion has been doing. So far from a time waster, defining sex is needed to clarify as to whether those who claim a gender identity that differs from their biological sex are covered by the exceptions in our Human Rights Act that permit single-sex services, facilities and sporting categories. Our unions are all lining up to encourage their members to put in submissions against the bill. The latest is the Nurses Organisation today, which would be the second largest union in New Zealand and predominantly women, obviously. The Public Service Association, which is like your Unison, put out an email to its 95,000 members, which includes 50,000 women, and asks them to stand in solidarity with our trans, intersex and takatapui whānau, which is Māori for, well, like a woman, we would say, not is a woman. And they are doing that in preference to their women members' own interests in protecting their sex-based rights. So the PSA says defining a woman and a man in law would undermine safe, inclusive workplaces and equitable public services for all. We would argue that's not actually the case, because those women who don't agree with the policies that have been introduced throughout the public service, including in health and education, if you don't agree with them, you either keep your mouth shut or you end up losing your job. And we're currently challenging that in the employment court on behalf of one of our members. They claim that it would increase discrimination exclusion for trans, intersex and takatapui people and roll back hard-won rights and protections, which is really hard to understand what they think those rights and protections are. And I should say that they have policies across the public service and in health that allow for transgender people to use whichever facilities matches their gender. And these have not been consulted, women have not been consulted about these provisions, policies. And they say it would create confusion in employment systems and practices, which we dispute as well, of course. They also make some comments about that it ignores Te Ao Māori, which is the Indigenous people of New Zealand, and their understandings of identity. Again, we dispute those assertions. Anyone who's been to a marae in New Zealand will have seen with their own eyes plenty of evidence in Maori traditional carvings that Māori had no trouble recognising the differences between women and men. And our churches, our liberal churches, have also lined up, and this is a massive billboard in the centre of Auckland. We don't care what's in your pants, and neither should our government. This Anglican church says the bill doesn't fix any real gap in the law. What it does is to write trans, intersex, taputapu and non-binary New Zealanders out of legal recognition, undermining 2 decades of protection under the Human Rights Act. And get this, we believe every person carries the image of the divine, no exceptions. So you can't be born in the wrong body then, right? Anyway, it says that legislation that treats anyone as less deserving of protection is a moral failure, not just a legal one. Note that they say that our government shouldn't get involved in what's in your pants, but actually our government has legislated to decriminalise homosexuality, legalise civil unions and then gay marriage, and include same-sex attraction as a protected ground in the Human Rights Act. So if sex is not defined, it's impossible to protect same-sex orientation. And this church is known to be one that's very welcoming to the gay community. So what are the polls saying? Well, this is the problem. The MPs all think that that they're reflecting what the population thinks, but we've been monitoring this, and it's a fact that the majority of New Zealanders actually support the idea of defining a woman as an adult female, and a man as an adult human male. That was the question that was asked. And you can see that's particularly the case amongst men. And what's dragging down the average is, unfortunately, women. And when we've tracked in a different set of polls what's happening in terms of party votes, political party affiliations, we see that even amongst the left-wing parties, there is more support than opposition of defining sex in law. So it's a fact. Sex is binary and biological. It's not a matter of opinion. Existing law already relies on this. And we note that the Human Rights Act protects against discrimination based on sex, including pregnancy and childbirth. And finally, we support the bill, but we want those 6 recommendations to restore clear and workable language. I haven't got time to show you this video, but you may have seen it online anyway. This is Anna Cody, who's the Human Rights Commissioner from Australia. It's hilarious. She is trying to argue for pregnancy protections for transgender women, for men, in other words. And this is a quote from Rachel Wong, who's from Women's Forum Australia. I won't read it out, but you can see it. So there, finally, I found this on Facebook the other day. I thought it was quite good. So that's it. That's our summary of what's happening in terms of what is a woman in New Zealand.
The 2nd of July as the deadline for submissions. Was that right?
Yeah.
Okay. So can you tell us a little bit about what happens next? Where is this bill in the process?
So the select committee, which is made up of people from across the political parties that are in Parliament, they will consider the thousands and hundreds of thousands of submissions that are flooding in. They will listen to oral submissions, but they've already said they're only going to hear from legal arguments. So it'll be mainly lawyers. And then after that, they produce a report and it goes back to Parliament for the second reading. And they've said already that is not going to happen until after the election, which is happening in November. So it won't be till next year that they report back. So if the Labor coalition wins government, becomes the government, then the chances of this bill going through are not that great. But if the Conservative side wins government in November, then it is possible that this could end up going through in an amended form, which we would support.
Question from Sasha. She asks, she says, I'm curious about, and I'm sure I'm going to get this wrong, the Takatapui.
Yes.
Are there women fighting with you from that group? She says, I see the capture of Two-Spirit Indigenous Americans with trans medicalization nonsense.
Yeah, so it's very contested as to whether Takatapui was culturally considered a trans form of sex or gender. It appears that it's probably referring to gay men or lesbian women who are, close to each other. There wasn't a written language, so we don't have a lot to go by. But that's what's been put forward. It's same as Whawhawhine in the Pacific Islands, and there's a lot of people from the Pacific Islands in New Zealand who now claim that Whawhawhine is a trans gender, but in fact a third gender. But in fact, it was always in the past regarded as being like a woman. So it was a man that was like a woman and would perform some of the roles of women, particularly in families that didn't have a lot of girls.